and welcome to Chess Talk. My name's Johnny Cockayne and I'm delighted to be joining you today from my flat in the city centre of Edinburgh, where the weather, rather unfortunately, is rather wet outside. Nevertheless, I hope you're nice and dry wherever you are, and I hope you're looking forward to the talk today. Now, Chess Talk, as always, is just part of the online social programme we put on here at Centre of English Studies. Just on Monday, we had a virtual tour of an aquarium in Canada, and on Friday, we're going to be doing some live yoga. There's lots of things going on as part of the school and part of the programme, and if there's something you're interested in, have a look at our Instagram page, our YouTube page, or even go on our website to find more details. As always, you can find all of the previous Chess Talks on our YouTube page, so you can watch them at your own leisure. We've got 10 talks up and running now, which means today is our 11th. And I have a feeling it's going to be one of the best. So sit back, relax, and enjoy week 11 of Chess Talks with me, Johnny Cockayne. Now, for some of you, this will be the first time you've attended one of our Chess Talks, but some of you, I can see from your names, have been here since the very beginning. And if you can remember back to week 5, we looked at the lion and the unicorn when we looked at differences in national animals between Scotland and England. And when I was talking to you about the lion and unicorn, I introduced you to my passport. Now, I didn't let you see inside, but I did tell you about some of the information you could find there. In all British and UK passports, you can find someone's name, you can find their address, and you can also find their date of birth. In fact, you can find all the information you need to steal their identity. And that's exactly why I'm not going to show you the inside of my passport today, at least not online. But there is one piece of information that is missing from the British passport, and that's your occupation or your job. Now, this used to be part of the passport, but in 1982, it was removed shortly before I was born. And that's a little bit disappointing, because I'd have really liked to have a passport that said occupation baby. But nevertheless, that's the way it is. But imagine the occupation was still in there. What would I have in my passport? Well, today I'm the principal of the CES school in Edinburgh, so maybe it would say school principal. Or, because I got it a couple of years ago, it might say marketing director or even teacher. But if we go back to my last passport, when I got it about 10 years ago, it would have said something very different, something maybe a bit unusual. Because you see, 10 years ago, I wasn't a school principal, I wasn't a marketing director, and I hadn't yet become an English language teacher. Instead, my passport would say under occupation, spermologist. And I know what you're thinking. What on earth is a spermologist? It's not a word you come across every day. So let's have a quick look at it. It's very clearly a noun. And perhaps looking at that ending, the ologist, you start thinking of a biologist, some sort of scientist, and you'd certainly be on the right track, because a spermologist is someone who studies something, but it has a special meaning. In fact, it has two meanings, and it's going back to the Greek, looking at that first part of the word sperm, because a spermologist, in the first case, is someone who collects or studies seeds. But that's not me. I fall under the second category of spermologist. I'm someone who collects or studies trivia. And that's really important because that's what today's Chess Talk is all about. Trivia, quizzes, and game shows. And trivia has never been so popular as it is today. While people have been spending time in lockdown, the number of online quizzes has absolutely skyrocketed. It's a great way to bring people together. So I think it's an ideal time to look at this particular topic. And if we're going to be answering questions on trivia, perhaps we need to ask a question to begin. What is trivia? We've probably all got our own ideas about it, and I think we can agree that trivia in many ways are facts. They are statistics. They are, and I love this word, little tidbits. They're little pieces of information, but not necessarily the most important information in the world. In fact, there's a definition of trivia from the early 20th century where they describe it as trivialities, bits of information of little consequence, little importance. And let's have a look at a piece of trivia and see if that's true. This is one of my favorite pieces. Did you know the American singer Frank Sinatra, famous for the songs My Way, used to take showers 12 times a day? Is it a fact? Yes, it is. Is it a statistic? Yes. A tidbit of information? Of course. Does it have any real consequence? Not really. It's a piece of trivia. It makes me smile. And that's what good trivia should do. So if that's allowed us to help define what trivia is, where does it come from? Where do we get the word trivia itself? Well, normally, if you're speaking to someone from Britain and they ask you where a word comes from, your first thought is William Shakespeare. Because after all, lots of words in the English language come from Shakespeare. Words such as birthplace, gossip, or even, surprisingly enough, mountaineer. All of these are words invented by William Shakespeare himself. In fact, we would argue that there are 422 words that appeared in Shakespeare for the first time, words that he created out of nothing. And depending on how much credit you give him, some people argue he popularized nearly 1,700 words through his plays. Now, trivia was not one of them. I'm not saying he never used the word. In fact, he used it 7 times during his plays. But he's not its inventor. In order to find out where the word trivia comes from, we have to travel back into the deepest, darkest parts of time, to one of my favorite periods, ancient Rome. And in particular, we're going to look at this man, Marcus Aurelius, emperor in the 2nd century AD and played on screen in the movie Gladiator by Richard Harris. Yes, the very same Richard Harris who was the first person to play Dumbledore in the Harry Potter movies. It's amazing how trivia connects everyone. Marcus Aurelius was one of the emperor philosophers and was regarded as the last of the 5 good emperors. And if you said to Marcus Aurelius, trivia, it's not important, he would be shocked. And not just because he'd never heard anyone speak in English before, but he would be shocked because in the time of ancient Rome, trivia, or trivium to give it singular, was the building block of education and was considered something very important indeed. So what was the trivium? What was these 3 building blocks? Well, they were logic, they were grammar, and they were rhetoric. And as an English language school, I definitely agree with at least 2 of those being important. These 3 aspects of education were the building blocks. They were the foundation on which all education and progression was made. So in Marcus Aurelius's time, trivia was certainly not unimportant. It was the opposite. It was vital. So what changed? Why does trivia have a slightly worse meaning today? Well, let's go forward in time, just a little bit, to the Middle Ages. Suddenly, logic, grammar, and rhetoric, they were no longer the founding stones of education. We'll get rid of that. Instead, they looked at something different. They weren't interested in trivium, they were interested in quadrivium, a word that is as difficult to pronounce as you would guess. So what is quadrivium? Well, it's one better than trivium, they said. It was 4 new aspects on which education was to be based: the trivia, That was for the man on the street, the commonplace, the everyday, not very important. In order to segregate yourself, in order to put yourself even higher, you needed to study different aspects. So what made up the quadrivium? Well, we had arithmetic, we had geometry, and we had music, and one other thing. Can you guess what it might be? What would be important in the Middle Ages? Well, if you went for astronomy, you were absolutely right. This was the quadrivium. This was what was important for education, and trivium, trivia, wasn't as important anymore. And we can see this change in attitude in some of the literature of the time. So Middle Ages, who are we going to go to? Our old friend, William Shakespeare. I told you he mentioned trivia 7 times. One of it was in his play, Henry VI, Part 2. And in this play, he has Henry give this impassioned speech, and yet we have but trivial argument. And Shakespeare scholars are very keen to point out that in this context, trivial means unimportant. So we've had a change in attitude towards trivia. Now, far be it from me to disagree with Shakespearean scholars, but I am going to disagree with them, because for me, trivia here does not mean unimportant, it simply means small. And that's something we've already agreed on. Trivia are small pieces of fact or information. And if the story of David and Goliath has taught us anything, and I like to think it has, is that size isn't everything. Sometimes small can be very mighty. In fact, let's look at a modern example. The boxer Floyd Money Mayweather, the most successful boxer of all time, at least financially. He's only 68 kilos in weight. That's less than half the size of his heavyweight colleague, George Foreman, and he's made nearly 7 times the amount of money in his career from fighting. Although, to be honest, most of George Foreman's money has come from his lean, mean, fat-reducing grilling machine, which is the most successful tie-in between a sports person and a product since Michael Jordan started wearing Nike trainers. So size isn't everything. Something small can have value, and trivia can have value. And I always feel British people have always put a value on trivia and a value on knowledge for knowledge's sake, even up to the very highest levels of power. If we were to look at the University of Cambridge, widely regarded as one of the top 5 universities in the whole world, it's a university that people struggle to get into. If you graduate from there, your life is set. But because it's so important, because it's so exclusive, it's one of only 2 universities in the UK where in order to get in, you don't just need to do good grades at school, you also have to sit a specific entrance exam at the university itself. Now, I'm going to tell you an apocryphal tale. Part of that exam, you are given an essay and you have to write on a particular topic in order to convince the rectors that you deserve to go to that university, that you are one of their kind of people. In the 1960s, there was a candidate who applied for Cambridge. I'm not going to tell you his name, he's reasonably well known, and it would be embarrassing. He was given an essay to write. Is it ever wrong to steal a loaf of bread? He looked at the piece of paper in front of him and he picked up his pencil and he wrote, I have no idea whether it is good or bad to steal a loaf of bread, but here are a list of all the kings and queens of England in chronological order. And you know what? They let him in. Because in the UK, sometimes we value facts, we value trivia just for the sake of knowledge. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I've been using the word trivia and the words fact almost interchangeably. But that's probably wrong of me, because trivia and facts are different. At their heart, they are both bits of information. But if we look at it deeper, Facts tell you something about the world. They're either true or false. They are. Trivia adds color to it. They give it context, they give it emotion and joy. And let's look at an example. This man here, some of you may recognize him, Sir Isaac Newton. Fact about Newton, he's credited with inventing the theory of gravity. It's a fact. It is what it is. Some people might find it interesting, some people might not, but it's not necessarily going to stick in the mind. And that is where trivia comes from. Because suddenly, if we add in the concept, Sir Isaac Newton is credited for inventing the theory of gravity, when an apple fell on his head, that little bit of trivia, that spark of joy, suddenly brings it to life and gives us a context to remember. So trivia, far from being unimportant, can actually create additional importance to facts. I love this quotation. It's by Ed Goodgold and Dan Karlinski. These two people wrote a series of books on trivia in America in the 1960s, really popularizing the whole field. And they said, trivia is concerned with tugging at the heartstrings. And for me, that couldn't be truer. Trivia creates emotion. When you read something, you might smile, you might groan, you might just raise an eyebrow. But trivia goes that little bit further. It is the enjoyment of fact. I'm going to add something else here. Man, top corner of the screen, maybe not the most recognizable by face, but if I tell you his name, Roald Dahl, it might set off a couple of bells. Because Roald Dahl wrote a series of children's books, including Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, turned twice into a movie, most recently starring Johnny Depp, a man who's appeared in more Tim Burton movies than any other person in the history of planet Earth. Now, when we say that Roald Dahl wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that's a fact. Again, it's not particularly interesting. Can trivia change that? I hope so. That's what I'm going to try and do. Because my bit of trivia about Roald Dahl, when he was a young boy, he worked as a chocolate taster in his local Cadbury's chocolate factory. Again, we've suddenly added context to the fact we had earlier. That little bit of trivia has tugged on our heartstrings and brought us a little bit of joy. Okay. British people have always shared trivia. It's a common thing to talk about when you're around the dinner table, walking back from movies, or if you've ever been to a pub, how many times have you heard two British men arguing over football trivia? It happens all the time. And as always, if anything becomes popular, someone will try and monetize it. And that's what happened with the board game Trivial Pursuit. In the year 1982, the same year occupation was removed from the British passport, two Canadian partners released Trivial Pursuit in Canada. And it was an overnight success. Today, more than 100 million copies have been sold worldwide, but the statistic, the bit of trivia I love, is that within 1 year of it being released, more than 20% of all Canadian families had a copy of this game. And it's a very straightforward game. It's simply asking and answering questions. But that love of trivia that I think we all hold dear made it a massive, massive success. And before we move on from Trivial Pursuit itself, have a look in the bottom corner. Here we have a Trivial Pursuit game piece. What do you call the bits and pieces inside there? Do you call them pie? Do you call them cheese? Do you even call them pizza? Lots of people get very passionate about this, and I don't know if it's because of the country grew up in, because of family, or just because of tradition. But people stick very strongly to their beliefs on what it should be called. Well, I'm going to give you the real answer, because I pulled out a copy of Trivial Pursuit from 1982 and I read the instructions. and according to the instruction manual, the official name for these game pieces is not pie, it's not cheese, it's not even pizza. It's wedges. So there we go. Unfortunately, it does tug at my heartstrings a little, but it probably makes me feel a bit sadder. Somehow, pie would be a little bit more joyful. So that was Trivial Pursuit, a very popular board game, but people have been interacting with trivia in interactive ways, in competitive ways for a long time, mainly through game shows. And game shows have been popular all around the world for a long time. I've put a still up here from one of the most popular and most long-lasting game shows in British history, Mastermind. It's a very simple show. You simply sit there and you answer questions. You succeed or fail based on your own knowledge. But there have been many different quiz shows over the years. Let's look at a few dates, shall we? The first ever programme in British television was broadcast in 1936. That's the same year that Jesse Owens won 3 gold medals at the Berlin Olympic Games. And it was just 2 years later, in 1938, when the first game show was broadcast. Not a quiz show as we would call it today, but rather based on the American concept of the spelling bee. And I'm going to be honest, this is not something I particularly understand or enjoy. It's a very American thing, but nevertheless, the success, the viewing figures of that very first spelling bee meant that quiz shows and game shows were here to stay. Now, something happened to British TV in 1955. We had our second channel launched. That was ITV, and it was the first commercial channel, the first channel to have adverts. And this changed things because up till this point, game shows, quiz shows didn't have cash prizes. Now, through sponsorships, through advertising, cash prizes were allowed. And in 1993, the upper limit for those prizes were removed. No longer was there a maximum amount you could win. The prizes could be as high as the showrunners wanted them to be. And that changed the face of British quizzes. So prior to 1993, what were people competing for if it wasn't for money? Well, it was simply to be the best, to prove that you knew more than anyone else. And naturally, that attracted a particular type of contestant. Quiz shows, especially ones such as you can see on the screen at the moment, University Challenge, tended to attract upper class and white contestants. They were very, very much rooted in the British class system, something that was lampooned in an episode of The Young Ones from the 1980s.
Hurry, I'll have to hurry you. Who is the richest person in the world?
Foot likes snot.
It's me, isn't it?
No, I'm afraid not. Your father's multinational collapsed only this morning.
Oh.
Certainly when quiz shows started out, you could see a reflection of the class in British society. What I find fascinating is that after 1955, when we saw the growth of quiz shows with cash prizes, we actually saw contestants that better reflected the makeup of British society. You were having more contestants coming from middle class backgrounds. And that was to continue throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Game shows were one of the very few opportunities where people could see non-Cambridge, non-Oxford graduates on a television screen. So we said in 1993, the prize limit was lifted for quizzes, and prizes went up, up, and up, till they reached perhaps their logical conclusion in 1998 with the first episode of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Now people were not competing for 10, 20, 50, 100 pounds. If they answered 15 correct questions, they could win £1 million, truly life-changing amounts of money. But as soon as you asked more money into the mix, you offer the opportunity for scandal. And this man here is definitely involved in scandal. He is Major Charles Ingram, and he was the third ever person to win the top prize, the jackpot, on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But there was something not quite right. He had a very strange way of playing. He would pause, he would change answer, he would hesitate. So the producers became very suspicious, and they went back and rewatched the tapes. And they became convinced that he'd had some help, that his wife and his friend in the audience were coughing when the right answer was being said and giving him clues as to how to reach that jackpot. Now, Major Ingram has always maintained he was innocent. However, he was found guilty in a court of law and he was thrown out of the British Army. Have a look at this clip. Do you think his wife is helping him out at all?
A1 or Craig David.
Guilty or innocent? I'll let you decide. The courts have already done so. So if that was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, we saw an increase in prize money, but at its very heart, there were very few gimmicks. It was simply asking questions and getting questions right. That changed as we entered the noughties, the year 2000 and above, when maybe society got a little bit nastier, maybe people got a little bit meaner. We certainly had meaner quiz shows, where it was no longer about getting the answers right, but it was about getting one over on your fellow contestants. It didn't matter if you knew the right answer. It came down to tactics, scheming, and sticking the knife in when you could. And this again reached a peak with the weakest link, with the queen of mean Anne Robinson, who rather than praising people for getting answers right, would mock them when they got things wrong. This was the television show that introduced the phrase, the walk of shame.
Trevor, you are the weakest link. Goodbye.
Luckily, nastiness doesn't last forever, and we have seen a change in attitude towards quiz shows again as we left the noughties. In fact, perhaps the biggest trend in quiz shows since that time was the rise of the celebrity quizzer. We are looking at a team in front of us, 5 quiz people, perhaps the greatest quiz team ever assembled on BBC's Eggheads. Each of these 5 people are former quiz champions in other television shows, including Judith Keppel, who was the very first person to win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and who didn't have a suspicious cough. We now saw members of the public going on to test their wits in a competition against these champion quizzers, these celebrities. And if Eggheads was popular in the BBC, their commercial rival ITV had their own version of The Chase, where members of the public again would come on and would be competing against celebrity professional quizzers in a battle of trivia. I personally love the quiz. There's a lot of focus on just answering questions, and there's something fairly exhilarating about seeing someone answer lots of questions very quickly. Take a look at this by Mark Labatt, a man nicknamed the Beast, which coincidentally was also the nickname of President Barack Obama's car when he was president of the United States.
Correct. By what 3 letters is monosodium glutamate
MSG.
known? Correct. What does A stand for and the acronym NATO?
Atlantic.
Correct. How many times has Brazil won the World Cup?
5.
Correct. In English, what country comes first in the alphabetical list of UN member states? Correct. Daniel, William, Stephen and Alec are the first names of which? Correct. Born in 1911, what did American playwright Thomas Williams change his first name to?
Tennessee Williams.
Correct. Unbelievable.
Just watching that, my heart rate has increased slightly. There is something genuinely exciting about trivia. And one thing we've noticed since the start of the 2010s, quizzes have become accepted as a form of sport. They are the way forward. We have celebrity quizzers and we have professional quizzers, and they're here to stay. But for the majority of people, they're never going to become a professional quizzers. And most people's interaction with trivia is not through a TV show, but with their friends. Week 2 of Chess Talks, way back in April, our Leeds principal Rob Tuck told you about pub culture, but one thing he didn't touch on was the pub quiz. Organised pub quizzes have been going on in the UK since the 1970s, when there were attempts to bring more people into pubs on traditionally quiet nights. In those days, you weren't able to give out cash prizes, so you could win beer, alcohol, and strangely enough, pieces of meat from the local butchers. Now, for health and safety grounds, we no longer give out slices of mince, although in some ways that's again a little bit of a shame. In 2009, when I found the statistic, it was estimated that there were 22,000 pub quizzes taking place in the UK every week. I can guarantee you that today, 10 years later, that number is much higher. Pub quizzes have been thriving and increasing year on year for a long time. And there's no specific structure for pub quizzes. They will normally be split over several rounds and categories. You might get questions on music, television, sport, film, and definitely on general knowledge. You might get music rounds where you have to identify the tune, and fairly commonly, you'll also get picture rounds, which give contestants a little bit of a break, and also, very importantly, the quizmaster a chance to rest their voice. And I'm speaking from experience when I say that. If you're talking for 2 hours hosting a quiz, you do need a bit of a break. Because I've been involved in quizzes for a long time. I took part in my first quiz when I was still at school, when, believe it or not, my history teacher encouraged me to go along to the pub. I was underage at the time, because he needed someone with some youthful knowledge on his side. That backfired very spectacularly when he realized I know nothing about music. But in 2003, I took a trip to the dark side and I became a pub quiz master. This is from the very first quiz I ever hosted, and this is the microphone from that very first quiz. It's one of the most enjoyable jobs I've ever had, because you see, quizzes bring people together. They are an opportunity to share trivia, to talk about areas of common interest you never even knew you had. It's not about getting the questions right or wrong, it's about the shared experience. I used to look forward to Freshers Week at university every year because you'd have new students. They didn't know each other. They were nervous. They didn't know how to instigate conversation. But as quizmaster, if you could ask the right question, if you could get that emotional response and get them to open up, you could help friendships form and develop. So I love quizzes. I think they're a great way of forging communities. Now, any quizmaster will have this in their mind. What is the perfect question? What makes a good question? Because when we hear them, we know good questions and we know bad questions. So what makes something good? Well, I came up with 3 rules. A good question should never seem unfair. Yes, you can ask a trick question, but that's not the same as it being unfair. People have to think you've given them the opportunity. A question should also never make someone feel stupid. We go to a quiz to have a good time. If someone tells us we're thick, we're ignorant, we're stupid, you're not going to have a good time. A good question, it shouldn't really matter if you get the answer right. It's the journey to get there and the opportunity to talk amongst your friends. And finally, a question should always give people a chance. You should always put enough clues in there to make it accessible. Now, right at the start, I told you about this man, Frank Sinatra. I'm going to look at 2 ways we can ask a question, and I want you to try and decide which is the better question. So option A, how many times did Frank Sinatra shower every day? Or option B, what did Frank Sinatra do 12 times a day that most people only do once? What do you think is the best question or the better question out of those 2? I certainly know what I think, and it's not the first. The first, all you can do is guess. You do not know the answer, and you're guessing a number. There's no excitement in guessing a number. You ask that question in a quiz, you'll see people shrug and maybe go, 4. There's no joy if you get it wrong. There's no joy if you get it right. That second question, well, there people can work it out. Everyone has experiences of what they do once a day. They can debate, they can argue, they can communicate. And if they get it right, they'll be happy. If they get it wrong, they'll probably laugh. So question 2, much better than question 1. I've asked some awful questions in my time. The very first question I ever asked in a quiz was terrible. It was, what was the name of the dog on The Littlest Hobo? How can you know that? It's a TV show that very few people watched. There's no clues. There's nothing interesting. It was an awful question. And I've spent the past 17 years thinking, how could I ask it better? If I was asking it again today, I would maybe phrase it like this. The dog in the television show The Littlest Hobo shared its name with which UK city that had the highest number of homeless people through the 60s and 70s? I've not changed the answer. I've also not changed the basic part of the question, but I've made it more accessible and I've made it more open. Now people can have a debate. Now people can talk amongst themselves and they can work their way towards the answer. We've given them the chance. So those are my questions. The first one there, awful. The second one, still not great, but it follows the rules a little bit more and it makes trivia, that most important of things, fun. I'm going to finish off by saying it's important to be trivial. People will tell you trivial things are unimportant. That's not true. You've heard this phrase, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. How many of you know that this is a misquote? The original quotation was actually by Alexander Pope, and it was, a little learning is a dangerous thing. And he's not saying we should never learn. What he's saying is we shouldn't stop. We should always try and explore. We should always find new pieces of information. And that information should be fun, because if it's not fun, we'll stop doing it. And that's where trivia comes in. Arthur Conan Doyle, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes books, once said, it's an axiom of mine that the little things in life are the most important. I certainly think it's the little things in life, the trivia, that bring us joy. And that's why I've been so happy to share my thoughts on trivia with you today. And I suppose before I go, I should really give you the answer to that question. What was the name of the dog in The Littlest Hobo? Any of you got any ideas? Which city in the UK had the greatest amount of homelessness in the 60s and 70s? London. I hope you got it right, but more than that, I hope you enjoyed working your way to the answer. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is my talk all about trivia. If you have any questions, I would be delighted to answer them. And it's been a pleasure welcoming you all today. Okay. So, does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? Got a couple coming in that we'll answer very quickly. Okay, so one question coming in from China, I'm guessing from the name. What is your favorite question you've ever asked? Favorite question I have ever asked is probably my favorite because I've asked over 100 questions that have the exact same answer. What is the largest carnivore in the United Kingdom, native to the United Kingdom? I asked that a couple of weeks into my hosting as a quiz. It's my favorite animal. And I went on to ask more than 100 questions where this was the answer. So what's the largest carnivore found native to the UK? Any ideas? I'll let you think about it. You can always drop me an email with your answer at a later date. We'll do 2 more questions, then we're going to have to finish up. Why do you think pub quizzes are so popular? Well, as I said in the talk, I think it's because of community. There's no point going to a pub quiz and doing it on your own. You go there with friends. And what it does, it gives structure for your evening. It gives you the opportunity to talk about a whole range of topics. You don't know what you'll be talking about before you go. There's no pressure on you because someone else is driving that conversation. And you'll learn things about your friends that you wouldn't otherwise. And one final question here. What's the best feeling when you're hosting a quiz? Best feeling when you host a quiz is when it's a music round and you're playing intros to songs and you've got a group of sort of muscular sports playing men, probably footballers or rugby players. They're very manly men. You play the intro to a song and within 2 seconds, one of them recognizes that it's by Take That. It's the sound that the rest of that group make. That is the absolute highlight of hosting a quiz. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to finish up there. Thank you very much for joining me at this week's Chess Talk. Next week's a really exciting time because not only do we have David back to talk about 90s music, but also next Friday, we're going to have another live CES Virtual Unplugged concert. So until then, thank you very much for joining me today. It's a pleasure as always. Stay safe and we'll see you soon.